Chapter 1061. If that's how I say it happened, that's what happened. Nonsense. Just because you say what happened, that's it. Zhang Yi looked him in the eye with a domineering expression. Yes, if that's what I say happened, that's what happened. Li Tianyang's temper flared, and his body trembled. He knew that it was useless to say anything now. Desperate, he decided to strike first, so he reached for his gun at his waist, and Zhang Yi did not stop him. When Li Tianyang aimed the gun at him, Zhang Yi pulled the trigger first. The bullet went straight through Li Tianyang's head, leaving a beautiful red birthmark on his forehead. The air was eerily quiet. The officers from the East Sea region were pale with shock. They had never imagined that their chief of operations, Zhang Yi, would actually kill someone on command. Zhang Yi put away his gun and, looking innocent, waved his hands at the people around him. Everyone saw clearly that I didn't want to kill him. He attacked first, and I was acting in self-defense. How dare the people around him say a word? He had even dared to kill Li Tianyang, so he definitely wouldn't mind killing one more person who didn't know any better. Black Tortoise's spirit body floated next to Zhang Yi and said coldly, "You've really messed up this time. Think about how you're going to explain this to the 2 districts." Zhang Yi tilted his head and said to Black Tortoise with a meaningful look, "Have you been so cautious and prudent since you became a mutant of Epsilon?" Black Tortoise thought for a moment and suddenly laughed, "Don't make fun of me. Since then, whatever I do is right." Ha! Ha! The two suddenly burst out laughing together. It was true. Nowadays, whatever Zhang Yi did was right. He was already Epsilon, and the Huashu kingdom needed his strength. Zhu Jing of the Jiangnan region would not blame him for deliberately hiding it, but would instead double down on pleasing him. As for the East Sea region, the anger there could be smoothed over with enough compensation from the Jiangnan region. Because the Jiangnan region had its own Epsilon. And no one cared about the corpse lying on the ground at this point. The Minister of Operations was a position, not a person. After Li Tianyang died, there would be Ma Tianyang and Niu Tianyang to take over his position. Black Tortoise dived underwater, and Zhang Yi had someone bring the people from the Jiangnan region over. He could not possibly follow Black Tortoise back to the East Sea region. After all, he had played the East Sea region for a fool this time, and if he really went over there, he would inevitably get into trouble again. Zhang Yi didn't bother arguing with them. He had already decided that, once he returned to the Jiangnan region, he would leave the mess behind and let Zhu Jing deal with it. He had been wondering how to explain to Zhu Jing the fact that he had secretly taken the source of God and sent the people of the Jiangnan region to their deaths. Now, Zhu Jing had also sent Spirit Guardian to lurk around him, which was the perfect excuse. For now, he didn't have to worry about Zhu Jing turning against him. On the contrary, Zhu Jing would have to be more careful to appease him. This was the law of survival in the end times. As long as you were strong enough, you were always right. The people in the Jiangnan region were gathered together, and many of them were injured, including Situ Xian, who had fainted at this time. But the others still learned about Zhang Yicheng's status as a Epsilon mutant. Looking into his eyes, they saw envy and awe. But then they thought about how Zhang Yi had tricked them, and it made them angry. Zhang Yi didn't care about any of that. After Black Tortoise arrived at the border of the Huashu kingdom, Zhang Yi told him to surface, and then chose to take the boat to take the people back. Black Tortoise couldn't turn his back on Zhang Yi at this point, so naturally, he obediently sent Zhang Yi and the others out. Zhang Yi opened the dimensional gate and took out a giant icebreaker, then commanded everyone to board. Deng Shintong and the others boarded one after the other, and then took all the wounded with them. Well, goodbye, everyone. Zhang Yi smiled as he said goodbye to Xuanwu and the others. Of the 4 spirits, only Black Tortoise was in good shape at the moment, and neither Azure Dragon nor Vermilion Bird was in a position to come and see them off, as they were both seriously injured. But if they were really here, I'm afraid they would be gnashing their teeth at Zhang Yi. Black Tortoise shrugged nonchalantly, actually, it's best if we don't see each other again. I don't think it would be a good thing if the 2 Epsilons met. Zhang Yi nodded. He thought of the black armored monster in the huge abyss on Star Island and was also filled with fear. "You're right." Zhang Yi said goodbye to the black tortoise and the big turtle swam towards the East Sea region. Zhang Yi, on the other hand, commanded the soldiers on board to steer the icebreaker towards Tianhai City. First go to Tianhai City, and then take the Blizzard City special train back to Blizzard City. At this time, everyone's attitude towards Zhang Yi became increasingly respectful. If they were angry at Zhang Yi's laziness when they first arrived, most of them now sincerely admired him. Some people might think that Zhang Yi had used this trick to harm too many people in the two regions, including their comrades in arms. But most people would only recognize Zhang Yi's strength. Because the strong are right no matter what they do, and they don't need to explain to the weak. Most of the people who have survived until now after the end of the world understand this truth. However, Deng Shintong and Lingu Feishue may not be able to fully accept Zhang Yi's actions. Zhang Yi had the wounded people taken care of, and was alone on the deck, leaning against the railing and looking out at the azure ice sea. Deng Shintong and Lingu Feishue walked over. Deng Shintong looked helpless, while Lingu Feishue's eyebrows were raised in obvious dissatisfaction. "Hey, Zhang!" Deng Shintong raised his hand and waved to Zhang Yi. "I can't believe you're the one who came out on top this time. It's really surprising. But since you've been in Epsilon for so long, why didn't you tell us? That way, we could have reduced our casualties." Zhang Yi said indifferently, "If I had told you, do you think you would have been able to pull off such a good show?" Deng Shintong ran a hand over his forehead and shook his head helplessly. Zhang Yi had saved his life, so he didn't want to say anything. Lingu Feishue was not as easygoing. She walked up to Zhang Yi, tilted her head, and looked him straight in the eye. Her ice-blue gaze was incredibly sharp, mixed with a strong anger. "We are comrades in arms, not enemies. At least when we are on a mission together, I hope you can consider our lives." Zhang Yi did not say a word when he heard this, and just looked out into the vast sea. The salty, cold sea breeze blew against his combat uniform, causing it to cling even more tightly to his skin. "Actually, none of that matters," he suddenly said, and then left on his own, without saying another word to Lingu Feishue or Deng Shintong. Because he was too lazy to explain anything. Everyone could blame him for this, and Zhang Yi didn't feel that there was anything wrong with that. Because they were thinking about the matter from their own perspective. But Zhang Yi didn't need to explain to them either, because Zhang Yi was thinking from his own perspective. So there was no right or wrong in this conflict, let alone a correct answer. It was just a matter of different stances. Then it's every man for himself. Chapter 1062, Brother Thin Ice. Zhang Yi didn't care what others thought about this issue. When he decided to obtain the Source of God alone and set a trap to lure the East Sea region and Columbia fleets into the game, he knew this would be the result. He had already obtained everything he wanted anyway. He found Spirit Guardian and asked it to hand over Flower and Lele to him. Spirit Guardian immediately released Flower and Lele from the Shadow Realm. The captive Totoro looked very funny, lying on Lele's back, fully anesthetized, with its tongue hanging out. Zhang Yi didn't say much, just called for Flower and Lele and left. Spirit Guardian looked at Zhang Yi from behind and suddenly shouted, "Zhang Yi!" Zhang Yi turned around. "How many times have I told you to use your codename at work?" "Codename Zhang." "Zhang Yi." "That." Spirit Guardian hesitated for a moment, then looked down and said, "It's not working time anymore." "Oh, that's right. So what did you want to see me about?" Zhang Yi asked, looking at her calmly. Spirit Guardian quietly clenched her fists, then gathered her courage and said to Zhang Yi, Can I follow you?" Zhang Yi's eyes revealed a look of surprise. "You want to follow me? Are you kidding? Aren't you Zhu Zheng's person?" Spirit Guardian explained, "I'm just an experiment. And the meaning of my existence is to help Zhu become perfect. My abilities need to be dependent on others in order to exist. For me, you are my best choice." Zhang Yi's face showed a look of enlightenment. If Zhu Yu was a duplicate of Yuan Kongyue, then there was a high probability that her abilities would be the same as Yuan Kongyue's. The reason why Spirit Guardian could quickly become a captain-level mutant was also because she used the Ice Spirit. During the time she spent with Zhang Yi, she slowly learned the truth about the Ice Spirit. She also understood that sooner or later, she would be sacrificed for Zhu Yu's perfection. So she wanted to find a way out for herself. Zhang Yi suddenly smiled. But why should I accept you? Your strength means nothing to me. I have the same abilities as you, and I'm even better than you. Most importantly, I can't be sure if you're loyal enough. That's the most important thing to me. Spirit Guardian Zhang opened her mouth, but in the end she could only name her only advantage. My shadow can hold living things. Zhang Yi thought about it for a moment, then he smiled. He didn't give Spirit Guardian any answer, but simply turned away. The conditions Spirit Guardian had proposed were not enough for him to accept this woman. Spirit Guardian looked at Zhang Yi, who had already walked away, with a sense of loss. After a while, one after the other, a group of strange-looking people in black combat uniforms emerged from the shadows behind her. They were all members of the Night Raven squad, except that, unlike Spirit Guardian, they were not transplanted with Yuan Kongyue cells. Instead, they were transplanted with Spirit Guardian cells. Therefore, these people all had the ability to control shadows. However, as transplants, they could not possess the full characteristics of the abilities, and they could only be considered Spirit Guardians in a degraded form. But as shadows, attached to every captain-level mutant in the operation, monitoring their actions, it was completely sufficient. Captain, we should report the situation here to the Commander-in-Chief, said a Night Raven in an icy tone. Spirit Guardian raised her head and resumed her usual expression of indifference. She placed her right fist on her chest and said, "Now, gather all the intelligence. Jiangnan Region, Blizzard City." Zhu Jing finished reading the intelligence transmitted by the Night Raven squad and sat in his chair in long silence. Next to him, a little person of just over a meter tall stood behind the chair, holding a pink bunny doll in her arms and looking up at him with an innocent face. Zhu Jing slowly lowered his head and glanced at the cute little girl before suddenly letting out a long sigh. He stroked Zhu Yu's smooth hair and slowly got up and walked to the windowsill. In Blizzard City today, the snow was still falling heavily, piling up on top of every building. The cold wind howled, and it seemed as if the snow would never stop, freezing the entire land. My life is like walking on thin ice. Do you think I can make it to the other side? Zhu Yu didn't know what Zhu Jing meant by this, and tilted her head curiously, blinking her big, cute eyes. Lan Xincheng looked at Zhu Jing beside him and opened his mouth, but didn't know what to say. Because the information they had received today was really too incredible. Coupled with some recent events, Zhu Zheng's plans had backfired one after the other, and he looked several years older. No matter how much I calculated, I still miscalculated Zhang Yi. He is more capable than I thought, which should be a good thing. But when he returns, he will definitely question me. I need to prepare how to deal with him. Zhu Jing raised his right hand, thought for a moment, and said to Lan Xincheng, "Prepare the supplies in the warehouse. Leave what we need, and prepare the rest for Zhang Yi. He is Epsilon now and has many subordinates around him. In the future, he will need more and more supplies, and he will still need these things. In addition, the supply of weapons and equipment is also open to him. Although he may not necessarily need them, it is also a kind of sincerity for us to give them to him. Oh, doesn't his friend Su like to come to Blizzard City to spend money? Pay attention to which technicians he likes, and reserve them specifically for him in the future." Zhu Jing arranged a lot of things as a token of his sincerity to Zhang Yi. As for Zhang Yi's plan to take over the Jiangnan region and secretly take the Source of God, Zhu Jing had no intention of discussing it with Zhang Yi. How could they discuss it? What would be the point? At the moment, all he could do was cling to Zhang Yi's coattails and ask him to stay in the Jiangnan region and help him. Otherwise, if Zhang Yi got upset, he could just leave whenever he wanted. Who in the 6 regions of the Huashu Kingdom wouldn't want an Epsilon? Lan Xinchen carefully wrote down all of Zhu Zheng's instructions. When they got to the back, his heart began to waver a little, because Zhu Zheng had given Zhang Yi too much. Commander Zhu, wasn't that a bit much? Zhang Yi is a mutant in the Jiangnan region himself, and is your subordinate. But if you do this, won't it seem like we? Lan Xinchen swallowed the rest of his words. Zhu Zheng glanced back at him and finished the sentence for him. It looks like we're trying to curry favor with Zhang Yi, doesn't it? Lan Xinchen didn't say anything. Zhu Zheng let out a small sigh. It's been a year. A year since the end of the world. Our Jiangnan region is the wealthiest region in the Huaxu Kingdom, and we've been comfortable for too long. In terms of combat power, we're also among the lowest in the country. But have we not encountered many things in this year? This is no longer the old days. Highly ranked mutants will become increasingly important. So far, none of us has a mutant of the Epsilon class. That's why we must do our best to retain Zhang Yi. Zhu Zheng looked into the distance. The tall, reinforced concrete walls of Blizzard City looked so solid that it would be difficult to bring them down even with large-caliber artillery. However, it could not even stop a Delta-class space ability mutant. Chapter 1063, Abnormal Awakening. Zhang Yi's ship arrived in Tianhai City and docked at Chaoyu Harbor. This trip did not last long, and Tianhai City was still the same as usual. Chen Jingwan came to greet Zhang Yi and the others. Zhang Yi said to Chen Jingwan, arrange a car to take them to Xiamayashan metro station. Chen Jingwan was momentarily stunned, but then nodded and told someone to arrange a vehicle to send the people away. He had originally thought that these were all bigwigs from the Jiangnan region, and that Zhang Yi would have to entertain them no matter what. Unexpectedly, they were just passing through. Deng Shintong came over and asked Zhang Yi, aren't you coming back with us? Zhang Yi heard this and gave a contemptuous smile. If I go back now, I'm afraid a lot of people won't be able to sleep, will they? Forget it. You go back and explain the situation here to the top. I'll come over naturally in a while. Even if Zhu Zheng didn't call him, Zhang Yi would still go. He owed it to Spirit Guardian to repay the debt of watching him secretly. Zhang Yi still had to have a good talk with old Zhu. Deng Shintong nodded thoughtfully. He reached out and patted Zhang Yi on the shoulder, looking at him sincerely and saying, Zhang Yi, you have saved me more than once. No matter what decision you make, I will always be on your side. Zhang Yi raised an eyebrow slightly and laughed playfully. Can you represent the Deng family? Deng Shintong was momentarily stunned, but then he laughed. I suppose I can. Zhang Yi's mind raced. You're good, Deng Shintong. It seems that you haven't given up on the power struggle in Blizzard City. He probably felt that Zhang Yi might fall out with Zhu Zheng, so he hurried over to win Zhang Yi over, so that it would be convenient for their family to ascend to power in the future. If others did not know Epsilon's strength, how could he not know it? Basically, in today's Blizzard City, whoever could gain Zhang Yi's support could become the #1 power. Ah, I remember, Zhang Yi responded indifferently. Deng Shintong's bright eyes flashed with a strange light. He thought to himself, Zhang Yi is different now than in the past. Our family must cultivate a closer relationship with him, and must not make enemies. Chen Jingwan arranged for someone to take everyone to the subway station, and Zhang Yi didn't bother to follow. He just wanted to go home and rest. After a major battle, what could be more intoxicating than returning home, enjoying the warmth and comfort of the house, sipping a cup of hot coffee brewed by Yang Xia's own hands, and then lying on Zhou Qir's pillow? Just as he was about to leave, Zhang Yi noticed a few familiar faces among the guards at Zhao Yu's base. One was a man with a crew cut, a mustache that was still relatively intact, a determined expression, and dark skin. There were also 2 other men with his general, bronze-colored skin. They were the fishermen he had brought back from Rock Flow Island, Lu Dehai, Rong Lei, and Yu Gang. After they were brought back, Zhang Yi had them separated and placed in 3 different bases to avoid them sticking together. Lu Dehai and the others were placed under Chen Jingwan. Little did he expect that they would become members of the guard so quickly. But on second thought, it makes sense. The population of Tianhai City is sparse. After several battles, there are now less than 20,000 living people left. It was one of the cities with the smallest populations in the entire Jiangnan region. The major bases also lacked young adults. Lu Dehai, Ren Xiang and Zhang Yi were all strong and capable, and were indeed likely to get ahead. Zhang Yi smiled slightly and waved his hand over there, "Come over here." Lu Dehai, Ren Xiang and Zhang Yi had been eyeing Zhang Yi for a long time. Of course, at this point, they knew that Zhang Yi was the true king of Tianhai City, and even the boss of their base, Xiang Yu, was just a junior under Zhang Yi. As soon as the three of them saw Zhang Yi beckoning to them, they immediately ran over excitedly. "Mr. Zhang." Lu Dehai respectfully nodded in greeting. He still felt awe and gratitude in his heart towards Zhang Yi. After all, it was Zhang Yi who had brought them back from the desolate rock flow island and saved their lives. Zhang Yi felt around in dimensional space and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, Jinling 12 Beauties, which was his preferred brand. He rarely smoked, but after the end of the world, he occasionally smoked a cigarette. He divided the cigarettes between the three of them, lit one for himself, and then simply threw the rest of the half-pack to Lu Dehai. This action made Lu Dehai and the others' eyes light up. Cigarettes were an extremely scarce resource after the end of the world. After all, except for the regional headquarters, which was still producing tobacco for the higher-ups, in the outside world, this stuff was out of stock, and the more you smoked, the less there was. "How have things been at the Chaoyu base recently? Are you still getting used to it?" Zhang Yi asked casually while smoking. Lu Dehai hurriedly replied, "It's been pretty good. We've been living a much better life here than we did on Rock Flow Island." Zhang Yi nodded, "If you think it's good, then do your best. I don't usually care about the three major bases. You have to fight for the life you want." After saying this, Zhang Yi did not wait for Lu Dehai to respond and just walked away on his own. Talking to them was just a passing whim. After all, they were the people he had brought back with great difficulty, and there was always some expectation in his heart. Zhang Yi opened the dimensional gate and was about to leave. At this moment, Lu Dehai and his two brothers looked at each other, hesitated for a moment, and suddenly shouted, "Mr. Zhang! Mr. Zhang! Please wait. Wait a minute." Lu Dehai was so excited that he could hardly speak, and his face was red with excitement. Zhang Yi curiously turned back. "Huh? What's the matter?" Lu Dehai scratched his head, looked around carefully, and then walked up to Zhang Yi, a little excitedly saying, "Mr. Zhang, I have also awakened my supernatural powers." Zhang Yi raised an eyebrow. "You awakened too? How did it happen?" Lu Dehai said, "It was while I was working one day, and suddenly I awakened." Zhang Yi was a little surprised. In his experience, awakening one's supernatural powers was a very difficult thing. For example, he and Yang Xinxin had both experienced life and death trials before they awakened. There were a few exceptions, but they had also used rare props to complete the awakening. For example, Yang Xia and Zhou Qir. But Lu Dehai, how could he say that he suddenly awakened? "Tell me more." Zhang Yi crossed his arms and looked at Lu Dehai curiously. Lu Dehai recounted the process of his awakening. That day, he was wearing a cold-weather suit and was carrying boxes of sea fish from a fishing boat down to the port. Then suddenly, he looked up, and the world in front of him turned white. Then his blood started to become strange, as if it had suddenly turned into lava, and after a while it turned into an ice river. In this way, the feeling of sudden cold and heat ran amok in his body. He fainted at the time, and after waking up, he found that his body had undergone a miraculous change. Chapter 1064, Surprise. Zhang Yi listened carefully, not missing a word. Lu Dehai's mutation process was the first time he had heard about it, and it was completely different from everyone else's. This might be a new mutation pathway. "Let me see your current abilities," Zhang Yi said to Lu Dehai. Lu Dehai lifted his sleeve and then opened his palm. With a little force, his skin color instantly turned dark green like seaweed, a fine layer of scales grew on the tips of his fingers, and even between his fingers appeared webbed fingers similar to a frog's. "Chong Wang." His forearm suddenly shot out a backward-growing bone blade, cold and intimidating. Zhang Yi muttered, beast type, marine species. It really suits your abilities. He looked at Lu Dehai and suddenly laughed. Does anyone else know about this? Lu Dehai swallowed. At the time, this matter attracted the attention of those above, and Boss Chen also knew. Zhang Yi thought for a moment, then pointed at him and said, "You three follow me back." Lu Dehai was overjoyed. Being able to draw closer to Zhang Yi would give them a better chance of developing in Tianhai City in the future. "Yes, Mr. Zhang. But we need to go report to Boss Chen first." Zhang Yi snorted, then casually called over a guard and said, "Tell Chen Jingwan that I'm taking the three of them with me." The guard soldier hurriedly nodded, "Yes, Mr. Zhang." Zhang Yi directly opened the dimensional gate in front of them, and then he took Flower and Lele with him and walked in. The three brothers Lu Dehai looked at each other and hurriedly followed. After stepping through the dimensional gate, the next moment, they appeared thousands of meters away. Although this was not the first time they had seen this miraculous technique, they were still greatly amazed by it. Before long, Zhang Yi led them to the long-lost shelter. Zhang Yi's return was naturally greeted by everyone in the family. However, they were still a little curious to see the three guys who followed Zhang Yi, with their hands tied, looking constrained and servile. Shou Kir pointed at them and asked, "Aren't they the fishermen from the island?" The three Lu Dehai hurried over to nod and bow to say hello. Zhang Yi smiled and said, "You go to the next room and rest for a while. Sia, go and pour them some hot water and get some fruit and pastries for them to eat." Yang Xia nodded with a smile, then reached out and elegantly invited them to sit in the next room. Lu Dehai and the other two nodded repeatedly, then walked into the small room for entertaining guests. Once inside, the three of them sat down on the sofa. Through the huge French windows, they could see the beautiful, but cold, snowy world outside. The three of them were so hot that they quickly took off their winter coats. "This is the life." Lu Dehai couldn't help but exclaim. The three of them were careful and only sat half their bottoms on the sofa, for fear of staining anything in Zhang Yi's home. Rong Lei and Yu Gang couldn't help but say, "If only we could follow Mr. Zhang around, that would be great." Lu Dehai's gaze became serious. "Who is this Mr. Zhang? He's a godlike person. It's not that simple to want to be by his side." To them, Zhang Yi was indeed like a god these days. His strength was beyond their ability to imagine. "You're right," Rong Lei nodded, and he also felt that being able to enter Zhang Yi's home was already a great blessing. As for following Zhang Yi around, he didn't even want to think about it. Yu Gang, however, said, "But, Brother Lu, you are a mutant now. There may not be no chance for you to serve Mr. Zhang." Lu Dehai took a deep breath, shook his head, and said, "I know myself best. The gap between me and Mr. Zhang is too big." He rubbed his rough hands together and said in a low voice, "I just hope that I can use my supernatural powers to make Mr. Zhang look at me a little more. If he says anything at all, it will make our lives in Tianhai City a lot better." As soon as he finished speaking, there was a sound of the doors opening outside. Yang Xia came in carrying a tray of hot tea, fruit and pastries and smiled as she said to the three of them, "You wait here for a little while, and Zhang Yi will be here to see you in a little while." The three of them stared at the hot tea and food she placed on the table, their eyes fixed. Even if they wanted to be reserved, they couldn't take their eyes off it. After all, for them, being able to eat egg white cake or eat as much fish as they wanted was already very difficult. Where would they find pastries and fruit to eat? Yang Xia smiled and said, "You don't need to be polite, just help yourself. If it's not enough, I'll get more." She also knew what the three men in front of her were thinking. But these things really weren't much for the shelter. Not to mention Zhang Yi's own dimensional space, which was stocked with a massive amount of food. Even after the end of the world, Zhang Yi had not forgotten to have Fatty Sue and Uncle Yu go and loot the large supermarkets. Those supermarkets and shopping malls that had been buried by the snow were full of supplies, and they had all been recovered. The shelter today simply would not lack for regular supplies. Fruits and other items were grown in their own backyard vegetable gardens. Lu Dehai and the other two men stammered and kept thanking Yang Xia. Once Yang Xia walked out of the room and closed the door, the three of them could no longer control themselves and rushed over to shove the food into their mouths. Living room. Zhang Yi returned home with Flower and Lele, and everyone was very happy. However, the women's attention was completely captured by the anesthetized giant Totoro. There was no way around it, the guy was just too cute, especially the way he couldn't move, looking just like one of those oversized plush toys sold in the supermarket. Zhang Yi brother, what on earth is this? Is it a gift you brought back for us? Yang Xinxin hugged the giant Totoro, her eyes full of stars. Totoro was obviously not used to these overenthusiastic women, and kept making threatening growls. Woof. Woof. But he was too weak at the moment, and the sound carried no threat at all. The effects of Compound 3 would last for a week, and with the anesthetic Zhang Yi had injected him with, he would basically be unable to move during that time. Zhang Yi took a sip of hot coffee and smiled. It was a creature I captured from Star Island. I brought it back for research. Zhang Yi looked at Zhou Qi and said, Qi, later on, you can take a blood sample from it to see what kind of creature it really is. The fact that Totoro could survive on Star Island, which was full of poisonous miasma, and that it had a special reaction with the source spirit made Zhang Yi very curious about it. I always feel that there is something unusual about this creature. Zhou Qi nodded, okay. Yang Xinxin reluctantly let go of his hand, then came up to Zhang Yi and intimately wrapped her arm around his. Brother, was this time on Star Island a big surprise for them? Chapter 1065, A Gift for Everyone. No one else knew about Zhang Yi's promotion to Epsilon, but the people in his family did. If it wasn't for that, how could the family members rest assured that Zhang Yi would just go to a place like Star Island with only Flower and Lele? Zhang Yi couldn't help but smile playfully at the thought of everyone's reaction after he revealed the truth. Of course. The expressions on all of their faces were really interesting. Uncle Yu said with some worry, but in doing so, you have also offended all the powers around the East Sea. No one likes to be made a fool of. From beginning to end, they were fighting for something that didn't even exist, and in the end, many people really lost their lives. The major powers around the East Sea all suffered heavy casualties. After all, this time they sent the best mutants in the country. It was absolutely impossible to say that they didn't hate Zhang Yi. It's fine, let them hate me. Zhang Yi put down the coffee cup in his hand and said with a smile, it doesn't matter, let them hate me. Anyway, when I was Mr. Nice Guy, not many people appreciated me for it. In the end times, as long as you are powerful enough, no matter how evil you are, people will fear you and come to curry favor with you. Now that Zhang Yi has become a mutant of the Epsilon class, who would dare to provoke him? Fatty Sue excitedly patted his thigh and said in a flattering manner, Boss is now a mutant of Epsilon level. He is a first-class powerful being in the whole world. Who would dare to mess with us in the future? Zhang Yi looked at Uncle Yu and Fatty Sue. That's not the way to put it. My strength alone cannot solve all problems. How are you guys doing now? Zhang Yi went to Star Island and obtained 2 copies of the Source of God. It was a very magical substance, a pure energy body. When you touched it, you understood its dimensional life evolution. He used one for himself and left one for Flower. There were also some fragments of the Source of God left for the rest of the family. Although he didn't know if it would be effective, he still wanted to see if this thing could help mutants below the Delta level evolve. Uncle Yu and Fatty Sue looked at each other, and they both smiled and said to Zhang Yi in unison, Zhang Yi. Boss, we've succeeded. Zhang Yi's eyes immediately lit up. He was right to guess that the Source of God could help Delta-class mutants break through their bottlenecks, and naturally it could also help lower-level mutants break through. Moreover, the required dosage was far less than that needed for Flower, Liang Yu, and the others to break through. In other words, you can now feel the power of co-symbiosis, right? Zhang Yi confirmed. The two nodded, indicating that they had now also been promoted to Delta-level mutants. Their abilities had undergone a qualitative change. However, perhaps due to limited talent, I am still far inferior to you. Uncle Yu scratched his head sheepishly and said with some embarrassment. In fact, when using the source of God, he felt very bad inside, thinking that he was a middle-aged man in his 40s with no talent, and was still wasting Zhang Yi's resources. Fatty Sue, on the other hand, was shameless, with a look of smug satisfaction on his face. Anyway, we are now Delta-class mutants. It's quite impressive to say it out loud. I won't let you down, boss. Zhang Yi leaned back on the sofa and raised an eyebrow. He didn't expect Uncle Yu and Fatty Sue to become powerful in the future. It was just that if they improved their strength a little, they could always play a bigger role in the future if the sanctuary encountered any trouble. Yang Xia and Zhou Haimei were in the kitchen. They had received news of Zhang Yi's return early and had prepared the ingredients in advance. They were now starting to cook and planned to cook a sumptuous meal. They smiled at each other as they listened to Zhang Yi and the others chatting. Nowadays, one of them was a cooking-type mutant, while the other was purely a nanny at home, providing services for everyone. They would not go to war, nor would they have the opportunity to fight. But now, with the men fighting in the war, they were in charge of the household, and they really enjoyed that feeling. Yang Xinxin and Lu Karen kept pestering Zhang Yi to tell them the story that happened on Star Island. Zhang Yi gave a faint smile. That would take too long to tell. Let's talk about it over dinner later. Oh, and Karen, I've got a present for you. Lu Karen's eyes lit up. A present for me? Zhang Yi got up from the sofa and then went outside the shelter. He opened the dimensional space and two huge warships slowly poked their heads out of it before coming to a stop in the huge courtyard in front of the shelter. Everyone was dumbfounded. Zhang Yi smiled and said to Lu Karen, "This is the material I promised you. I got it from the Columbia Navy. It should be the most advanced warship in the world right now. I think it's enough for you to use." Lu Karen's eyes were almost like 100-watt light bulbs. This is fantastic, simply fantastic. Thank you, brother, you are the best. Lu Karen's happy, rosy face turned red, and she put her arms around Zhang Yi and gave him a fierce kiss on the cheek. Yang Xinxin's eyes widened, Zhou Ke covered her mouth, and Liang Yu coughed softly, her expression slightly unnatural. She never imagined that Lu Karen would be so bold as to kiss Zhang Yi directly in front of everyone. However, everyone also knew that Lu Karen, with her mechanical mind, couldn't help but be attracted to such a good industrial material. But everyone also knew in their hearts whether she had other thoughts about Zhang Yi. A young girl in the flower season, with her emotions just beginning to stir, would easily fall in love with an outstanding man. Add to that the female psychology of wanting to be strong, and it was only natural that she would fall for Zhang Yi. It was just that Lu Karen was more shy and didn't dare to say it outright. It seemed that she had sensed the strange looks from the others at her actions, and her face turned even redder. She lowered her head and whispered, I'm just so excited, thank you, brother." Zhang Yi ran a hand over his face. Although it was quite cold outside, the girl's lips were 36 degrees. "When have I not kept my promise to you? Take it, I'm also looking forward to your mecha." Lu Karen nodded vigorously. "Keep it safe, brother. Karen is working faster and faster these days." She clenched her little fist. She had been training every day on her ability to divine machinist, and she had become more proficient at using it. Zhang Yi looked at Uncle Yu and said, "Uncle Yu, I'll leave the cutting and transporting of the materials to you." Uncle Yu laughed heartily and said, "Need I ask? It's definitely going to be my job."